faithfully conveying value and interpreting great books from around the world. Hello, this is Sally's Book Talk. Today, we're interpreting the book, Why Do We Get Scammed? In the news and in daily life, everyone often hears about or personally experiences all kinds of scams. For example, elderly folks spend tens of thousands on so-called miracle mattresses, and patients' families pay sky-high prices for life-saving drugs of unknown ingredients outside hospitals. College students get scammed out of thousands in living expenses by online friends. Why do people fall for scams? Is it because scammers are exceptionally cunning? Or are the victims just plain foolish? The book we're discussing today aims to answer these very questions. The author, Maria Konnikova, is a psychology PhD from Columbia University. She gathered tons of real cases from news reports, interviewed some scam victims, and broke down every step of these scams, from the setup to the execution to the finale. Right after its release, this book got rave reviews from magazines like Forbes, The Economist, and The New York Times. The New York Times Book Review praised Konnikova for her sharp insights into the dark art of fraud. The book has 10 chapters total, split into 3 parts. Part 1 is Chapter 1, where the author sketches a profile of scammers. Part 2 covers chapters 2 through 9, where she dissects each step of the scams and dives into the psychology behind them. Part 3 is Chapter 10, where the author offers tips on avoiding scams. Now, I'll break down this book for you in 4 sections. First, what traits do scammers share? Second, how do scammers set traps step by step? Third, why do people fall for scams? Fourth, how can we protect ourselves from being scammed? Let's start with the first question. What traits do scammers have? What kind of people become scammers? Are they born that way? Do they all look shady and sinister? The author believes scammers don't share physical traits, but they do have common personality features. Psychologists call these common traits the dark triad, 3 personality characteristics with dark aspects. The first is callousness. Scammers often show extreme indifference. People with this trait act solely for personal gain, completely lacking empathy for others. The suffering of others means nothing to them. So, when people pour out their heartbreaks and family misfortunes to scammers, the scammers don't feel a thing. Instead, they see it as a golden chance to profit. The second personality trait is narcissism. Scammers are often super narcissistic, thinking they're better than everyone else. A study on nearly 600 corporate fraud cases across 78 countries found that almost half of those involved did it because they felt superior. They think they're clever, see others as fools, and figure they deserve more. The third trait is a knack for manipulating others. Lots of scammers are pros at controlling minds, getting people to obey them so they can exploit them for their own gains. Let's see an example. There's this guy Stokes, a drug addict who's always hitting people up for cash to feed his habit. Then one day, his nephew got run over by a school bus and died. After that, Stokes started knocking on doors all around the neighborhood. He told each neighbor about the awful event and asked for donations to help the kid's family cover the funeral costs. He'd pull out his phone and show photos of the little boy. Lots of folks got teary-eyed over the heartbreaking tale and opened their wallets, so Stokes made a killing. Well, in this example, Stokes shows the classic signs of being cold-hearted and manipulative. The kid's death was a major tragedy for the family, but Stokes didn't care. He just used it to make a buck. That's pure cold-heartedness. Stokes controlled folks by showing pictures of the little boy. That sharp contrast, a happy kid meeting a tragic end, made people feel sorry and cough up cash as he suggested. Naturally, not everyone who has one of these dark traits turns into a scammer. A couple of psychologists tested 1,000 marketing folks and found more than 10% like to manipulate people. Since marketers have to sell stuff, they usually need top-notch persuasion skills. Actually, if you personality test politicians, Wall Street big shots, and legal eagles, you'd see a lot of them score high on the dark triad. So, these folks have the traits that could make them scammers, but they stick to legal work. But if people with the dark triad personality traits also meet 2 other major conditions, things get very different. The first condition is having an environment conducive to deception. This is an objective inducement. For example, traders at securities firms are usually upright, honest, and law-abiding. But if their company has major regulatory loopholes, those traders might commit fraud. Take the hedge fund ACC company. Due to lax internal oversight, almost everyone was engaging in insider trading. This company was notorious in the US. The second condition is finding a justification for one's actions. This is a subjective willingness. A person with criminal tendencies will find a reason to act when they spot a good opportunity, and many scammers believe they're forced into scamming. One survey shows that about half of fraudsters claim their competitive environment was extremely unfair. And their reason for scamming is just to make the game fairer. Scammers often portray themselves more as victims than criminals. The so-called unfair environment scammers talk about is the same for most people around them, yet most don't become criminals. That wraps up the first part. What traits do scammers have? Scammers often have innate traits like callousness, ruthlessness, narcissism, and skill in manipulating others, but they also need a conducive environment and self-justification to become scammers. Now we come to the most exciting part of the book. How exactly do scammers set traps step by step? I'll break down the scammers' tactics into 3 stages: setup, execution, and finale. In the setup phase, scammers usually have 2 steps. First, identifying the target, and second, building rapport with the target. Let's start with the first step. How do scammers pinpoint the most gullible, deeply scammed individuals, the perfect targets in a sea of people? They often use 2 tricks. The first is proactively offering information that others care about. For instance, there's a scammer named Bernie Madoff who specialized in deceiving stockbrokers. He was Jewish. In many people's eyes, being Jewish means being good at investing or knowing insider information. When talking to people, Madoff would often mention that he came from a Jewish community. During conversations, Madoff would carefully observe people's reactions, like whether they were interested in his Jewish identity or tempted by insider trading. The moment someone showed even the slightest interest, Madoff would seize it and use fake inside information to deceive them. Another example, a fake model named Dennis posted tons of photos on dating sites, claiming he didn't want to be just a pretty face anymore and wanted a fresh start. Anyone interested in his photos and story became his target. But the second common trick scammers use to lock onto victims is building familiarity. People tend to let their guard down around someone they know. For example, people feel warmer towards someone who can correctly say their name. So, making victims feel familiar becomes a crucial survival skill for scammers. Take a hacker group that attacks company security systems under the guise of helping detect vulnerabilities. One member would hang out at cafes near companies, striking up conversations, often just small talk, but incredibly effective. Because chatting builds familiarity, making people friendlier. Once you've met, you're no longer a stranger. And later, when this person offers to check security flaws, victims often think, "Ooh, we met, had coffee together. What luck? Of course I'll help you." Some scammers deliberately gather intel on victims to gain their trust. Like Nancy, who'd browse wedding announcements, targeting soon-to-wed couples' parents. Nancy memorized names, addresses, and phone numbers from the papers days before weddings. She'd call one set of parents, say the grooms, claiming to be the bride's relative since she knew her name. The groom's parents would believe her and meet without suspicion. Some even hired decoys, like an Indian monk claiming to connect people with dead relatives, planting actors in his waiting room. When people seeking help arrive, these decoys pretend they're also there for assistance. They chat with victims and feed information to the monk, so when victims meet him for the first time, he can miraculously reveal personal details, making them believe he has supernatural powers. Scammers have a famous saying, "Once you understand someone completely, they'll buy whatever you're selling." That understanding process is how scammers investigate and filter their targets. Plus, today's scammers blast out fake ads, emails, app notifications, and embedded web pages. Anyone who responds becomes self-selected prey. You might notice these phishing attempts are full of typos. That's actually intentional. If people miss such obvious errors, they're even less likely to spot the holes in the story. After identifying targets, the setup moves to step 2, building an emotional connection. The crucial phase. Only when emotions override logic will victims lose their judgment and follow every instruction. On dating sites, fake model Dennis targeted Paul, a 68-year-old American physicist. They began exchanging frequent, intimate messages. In these letters, Dennis constantly professed love to Paul. Dennis told Paul, "You're incredibly brilliant. That's what I value most in a man. Your intellect and my beauty are the perfect match." Paul's emotions were completely ignited. He fell head over heels, even considering Dennis his fiancé. He agreed to every request Dennis made without hesitation.
So when Dennis tricked Paul into transporting cocaine, the physicist didn't suspect a thing.
Remember Nancy who browsed wedding announcements? By correctly naming the couple, she tricked the groom's mother into meeting, then initiated step 2. Step 2, building rapport. She discussed wedding gifts she bought the couple and mentioned where she lived. Always choosing locations near the bride's family home, Nancy warmly invited the mother to visit sometime. So, the groom's mother chatted more happily with her and treated her to a lavish lunch. Only when leaving did she pretend to forget cash and ask for $50 for a taxi. Though the amount was small, Nancy pulled this trick repeatedly. That's the power of emotional manipulation. Once victims develop fondness for scammers, they become easily controlled. They blind themselves to red flags. How do scammers build this bond? Their go-to method is using stories to trigger emotional responses, like the nephew killed by a school bus. That tragic tale sparked pity, making people donate. Fake model Dennis told physicist Paul about being called a pretty face and wanting to restart his life. Nancy told the groom's mother about carefully selecting wedding gifts. She emphasized how long she spent choosing. Now, with targets hooked and bonds formed, the real scam begins. During execution, scammers follow steps. First persuasion, then profit demonstration. Next comes a small win to lure bigger investments, finally reeling them in. Let's examine these steps through a case study. Melvin Barrett worked at a charity for 30 years, earning numerous honors. In his retirement year, his subordinate Matthew Brown asked if he wanted to run for police chief, a position in Brown's hometown of Lincolnshire. Now, Brown initiated step 1, the persuasion trap. Brown told Barrett about his extensive hometown connections, claimed his father was a high-ranking diplomat and mother Welsh royalty. Barrett grew tempted. Becoming police chief near retirement felt like a miracle. To boost trust, Brown's mother wrote saying Barrett only needed £10,000 for the campaign. She'd cover the rest. She also invited Barrett to join their family charity board, deepening his trust. So he decided to run for police chief. With step 1 successful, Brown moved to step 2, demonstrating potential profits. Brown actively campaigned, working hard to solicit votes, distribute flyers, run TV ads, create a new website, and open a Twitter account. He showed Barrett independent polls funded by his mother, where Barrett's approval ratings kept rising. These results proved one thing to Barrett: he was sure to become police chief. Tasting success, Barrett invested more, handing over his private account to Brown. At this point, Brown began reeling him in. He claimed his mother's funds couldn't be accessed immediately and he needed money for cash flow. Money was transferred from Barrett's private account, and ultimately, Barrett was scammed out of £100,000. After executing the scam, it's time for the finale. In fact, at this point, scammers don't even need to wrap things up. They can slip away perfectly. Why? Because to protect their reputation, many victims choose to hide being scammed and don't want anyone to know. If physicist Paul hadn't been implicated in drug trafficking, he wouldn't have admitted being scammed. Another example is a scammer named Damara, who who started as a drifter with no job. To land a high-paying job, he posed as a doctor and joined the Canadian Navy on a ship.
In 1951, while serving with the Canadian Navy, he performed 19 surgeries without any medical qualifications.
Since the surgery succeeded, he even proudly gave a newspaper interview. This interview exposed Damara to the real doctor he was impersonating, who reported him to the Canadian Navy. But afterward, the Navy didn't jail him. The Canadian Navy was deeply ashamed, tasked with national defense yet unable to protect their own personnel.
Damara walked away scot-free from Canada and next posed as a prison warden, a school English teacher, and a civil engineer at a construction firm. His exploits were even written into a biography.
Damara escaped perfectly every time, largely because institutions he scammed didn't want to go public. A survey by AARP showed that among victims over 55, only 37% admitted being scammed. Among victims under 55, only half admitted it. Most scammers aren't even taken to court. They simply won't get caught. Instead, victims become accomplices to the scammers. So, the author bluntly points out that victims themselves ensure scammers escape. To summarize, in the setup phase, scammers impersonate someone you'd want to know, or screen targets by gathering your info. Then, they build an emotional bond with the targets. In the execution phase, they persuade to set the trap. First, letting victims taste a small win, then luring bigger investments, finally, reeling them in. After reeling them in, scammers exploit victims' fear of reputational damage to vanish. Now we've analyzed scammers' traits and setup. Next comes part 3. Why do people fall into scammers' traps? First, people often have a superiority bias. What does that mean? There's a saying, if something looks too good to be true, then it probably is fake. But if it happens to them, many think they're unique, extraordinary. So good things could genuinely happen to them. Like Paul, the 68-year-old physicist who believed he was superior and meeting a beautiful model wasn't impossible. Barrett, nearing retirement, had honors including the Order of the British Empire. Naturally, he felt fully qualified for Lincolnshire police chief. Second, people don't want to lose sunk costs they've invested. When spotting flaws in a scam, they've already invested too much upfront. Whether emotions, trust, or money, admitting they're scammed means wasted investment. This is the sunk cost fallacy. Costs too high to back out, so they cling to hope it's real. Finally, environmental factors influence susceptibility to scams. If someone's lonely and helpless, like from unemployment, divorce, or illness, they're easier prey. Even calm, patient people become more emotional, impulsive, and risk-taking during such major life changes. For example, a woman named Saffield just went through a breakup. On her way home, she passed a psychic shop, similar to fortune tellers, offering palm reading, astrology, etc. And every time she passed the shop before, Saffield was a bit curious, but her boyfriend would remind her to stay away. It wasn't a good place. Now, heartbroken, Saffield trudged home dejectedly. She saw the shop again and instantly recalled her ex-boyfriend's warning. Her rebellious feelings surged. Why should I still listen to him? And what harm is there in just taking a look? Oh. And just like that, Saffield walked into the psychic's shop, where a scam was waiting for her. Victims aren't necessarily foolish or greedy. It's just that when scammers show up, victims happen to be emotionally vulnerable. At their most irrational moment, if we must pinpoint one common trait among victims, it's that they're all human, and humans make mistakes. Similarly, linguist David Moore, who deeply studied the fraud world, summed it up. Scammers probe the weaknesses in human nature. Therefore, unless human nature changes dramatically, prey for scams will keep emerging endlessly. Finally, let's discuss how ordinary folks can avoid being scammed. The author suggests 4 key pieces of advice. The first piece of advice is to have clear self-awareness, which includes at least 3 aspects. First aspect, know your own boundaries of ability. For example, If you have no financial background and lack knowledge, don't expect to make big bucks from stocks recommended by others. Another example, if your close friends often say you have a short temper and you argue with them now and then, don't expect someone to suddenly appear who's totally obedient and never complains. Second aspect, know when you're most vulnerable. For instance, when work is tough, after a fight with a partner, or when a family member is sick. During these fragile times, avoid making big decisions. Third aspect, know what moves you most easily. Is it when others compliment you that you're quickest to trust them? Or do you have zero resistance to people who adore small animals? In the face of sweet talk, we must stay alert to avoid falling into traps and getting scammed. The second piece of advice is to stay objective, using logic instead of emotions to think. You need to learn to pay attention to details and use logical reasoning to grasp objective reality and spot inconsistencies. If someone tells you a stock will soar the next day, then you should think, if it's such a great deal, why isn't he buying it himself instead of telling you? Another example, someone you've never met passionately declares love for you. You need to stay rational and ask if you really have that much charm. The third piece of advice is to gather relevant information. When someone introduces you to an unfamiliar field and you're eager to join, you must learn the basics beforehand. Also, if a stranger suddenly claims to be a friend of a friend or that you attended an event together, take time to verify with your friend or the event organizer. The last piece of advice is to set boundaries. Many scams succeed because scammers push victims past their limits in moments of excitement. Everyone can be scammed. So before any risky move, set a boundary. Can you bear the risk? What's the maximum loss you're willing to accept? If the loss is within your limit, you might risk it once. Treat it as a lesson if scammed. But be careful. Never let others push you to just one more try, because that leads to a bottomless pit. When facing such temptation, know who to turn to for help to ensure you can back out safely. Tell your parents, confide in your most rational friend, or just call the police. That's it. I think the final part is also covered. The author offers 4 tips to prevent being scammed, urging people to understand themselves objectively, calmly, and comprehensively, and to gather relevant info.
Lastly, even if scammed, set boundaries and stop in time.
In today's world where scams keep emerging, I hope this book helps you understand human weaknesses better. Craving wonderful things is human nature, but stay aware. High doesn't fall from the sky. This reduces the chance of being scammed. All right, why do we get scammed? That's all for this book interpretation. The reading notes are below the audio. See you next time.